Welcome back to another episode of Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals, otherwise known as FPOG. This week on the podcast, we are doing part 2 of generational financial planning. And if you're not watching us on YouTube, you're missing out because Justin and I are wearing matching gingham purple shirts. But on to the podcast. So this is part 2 of James Hughes' book, Family Wealth. And in the first episode, I'd encourage you to go back to listen to it. I think it was episode 23. We talked about why legacy planning matters for everybody. We really kind of talked about, the different dimensions of capital, intellectual, human, financial as well. But we also talked about, how legacy generational planning works in incorporating like a long-term time horizon. But in this episode, Justin, I want to transition to getting more tactical, right? So like hopefully our listeners have listened to that episode and they're bought in and they say, okay, I think legacy planning matters, but that's a good idea, but what does that mean for me today, right? Like I'm bought in conceptually, but what do I do with that? And James lays out some great tactics in the book and kind of some frameworks, and we're going to pull a lot from that and also maybe repurpose and right size it, because I would say his demographic is probably a higher net worth clientele, or probably ultra high net worth. So there's a little bit more rigidity and complexity. So we'll kind of right size it, but the principles are still really good. And there's a lot to take out from there. Let's start with just talking about this idea of like memorialization, right? And like why, like what does that even mean and why it matters to legacy generational financial planning?
Absolutely. And again, this book, Family Wealth by James E. Hughes. If you're watching us on YouTube, we've got it there on the screen. One of the interesting things, I was listening to another podcast recently, and it tied in perfectly to this. The podcast is called Founders Podcast. And really interesting deal. The host of the podcast reads multiple books on famous business leaders, entrepreneurs of the last 200, 300 years. And then he does a long form podcast on it. But he did one on the wealthiest woman in America about 150 years ago. And let's see, I believe her name was Hetty Green. And what was interesting was her family had this sentence that they would just drill into her. And the sentence was, property is a trust to be taken care of and enlarged for future generations. And when you think about memorialization, I do think square one is just, are you talking about these things? Are you thinking about these things? And is there an attempt to even be mindful of, am I training up the next generation to handle wealth? And I want to repeat that. Property is a trust to be taken care of and enlarged for future generations. And you could also, you could take James E. Hughes' definition, and instead of property, it's just wealth, capital in all of its forms: financial, relational, emotional, intellectual, human capital, every form of that. Is your family asking those questions and being aware of, hey, are we taking care of everything we have and growing it for future generations?
Yeah, totally. And like too, right? I think where you started is important because, you have to set the expectations that, hey, this matters. Like, hey, what is our North Star, right? Before you can memorialize, you have to decide, right? Like what is important to us as a family. And Justin, you and I were talking before we started recording of, if you were to ask a family, like, why does your family exist? Like, what is the goal and the hope? Like, what do you hope is true of the world because of your family's existence, right? It's a really big question that a lot of people haven't even thought to ask. And it's a big one, but, as you begin to answer that's the beginning of the journey. But a couple of tools that he mentions in the book that are great is a family mission statement. And he defines it as an expression of purpose, vision, values, and goals for a family over multiple generations, right? And so having a mission statement that's written that people can go back to I think is really important, right? Because, if I'm reflecting on my own life. Like, why does our family exist? Like, what do we hope? What's unique about our family? What can we offer the world? What are we really passionate about? How do we want to deploy our capital? It's really unclear in most families, and they've never had the conversation. So that's a huge, important, and I would say tough thing, right? That's a really big existential question. You don't only have to answer that question personally, but for you as a family unit. But it's a worthwhile one, and as you begin to work through and process the answer, and I'm sure that answer may change over time because of how big of a question it is, you should memorialize that family mission statement and follow it over time.
That's a great thought. And the other thing that he points out, that there should be an inward component to that family mission statement and an outward component that deals with the outside world. And so that really encompasses what's your purpose, vision, values, goals. So what do you want the DNA of your family to look like? What type of people do you want to be? And then what type of role do you have in the world? What do you have to offer the world? And Jared, one thing you mentioned before we started recording that I want to highlight, it does need to be broad enough to last multiple generations and encompass a lot of different personalities. It can't be so narrow that, well, the only way to live out that family vision is if my children, for example, are exactly like me, because they're not going to be.
Yeah, a great example of that is like like a good family mission statement, but probably incomplete and lacking that won't last multi generations. Is I want to eradicate malaria in the Middle East, right? Like if your kids, if you're passionate about that, if you have a scientific bent, like maybe there's a ton you can do there, and that's a great and hugely noble cause. But if all your kids are artists, they're not really going to know how to apply their skills and energy and expertise to that demographic, right? But another iteration of kind of that same underlying idea, but just more broad, is hey, I want to change the North African corridor and create economic and human flourishing, right? And like you've decided as a family that's a region you're really excited about, but it's still open-ended enough to where people can deploy their human capital in line with that goal easier. So that's kind of the challenge there. It needs to be specific to your family and your passion and your family's history and goals, but also broadly enough to where it honors the diversity of human capital. Yeah, because like you said, Justin, having the goal of your family be to perpetuate Brownlee wealth management, that'd be a bad one. That'd be a bad family mission statement because it pigeonholes your kids and doesn't meet them where they're at, and it can't live. Its odds of outliving you go down, right? Because it doesn't meet them where they're at. So that's a great call out there.
I think it's really helpful to use an example like that. If a family had a mission statement that was somewhat health oriented, like your example of we want to eradicate malaria in a specific part of the world, I would hear that, me personally, and I would feel completely removed from that because and I was about to say I have no interest in that. That's probably not exactly correct. The better way to phrase that is I have no gifts personally that could help in that mission. So you're right. It's too narrow. And if I hear something like that, my immediate thought is, well, I have nothing to contribute here.
Yeah. And two, I guess that kind of alludes to, right, this needs to be memorialized, but also like the individual passions of your family needs to be memorialized, right? Like this shouldn't be an exercise that happens like one night with just yourself, right? This needs to be ongoing dialogue, right? You need to memorialize, like one of the things that James also recommends, like he constructing a family balance sheet that's really taking inventory of human capital, relational capital, financial capital, right? Like take inventory of strengths and notice patterns, and read through the family's history and think about your generations and what themes or threads have been pulling on your family for really long periods of time, and get your kids involved in that decision, right? It should be something that happens as a family, not just one night with one person.
Yeah. And so it's helpful. And you need a little bit of both. What are the values? What are the specific things that you want your family to thrive in within your family? And what types of things do you want your family to accomplish? And so really good to ask those questions. And yeah, I think it all even just starts, the beginning of it is, are you thinking, hey, what wealth do we have? What is our financial capital? What is our relational capital, our intellectual capital? And then are we being mindful of taking care of it and growing it for the next generation.
Yeah. Let's move on to the second point. So it's all about memorializing, right? It's kind of articulating, okay, what matters to us, and then memorializing, like in writing, right? What are my assets? What's my mission statement? Having kind of a north star you can look back to, and a family history that can be passed along, right?
Okay, so one, I love the idea of having a family history. My family fortunately has a pretty extensive written history, which is just really, really cool. So I love that idea of trying to give your family an idea of where did we come from? Like what were our family members doing generations ago? But the other thing to think through, you mentioned this several minutes ago, I think before we started recording, that is memorialization is typically like really when you think about that word, that's creating a document, right? Like the founders of the United States created a constitution to memorialize some of the things they were thinking about. So memorialization is typically a document. Now we're talking about family wealth. This is kind of tangential to estate planning. One big call out we want to make. This is not a will. This is not a living trust. That is a specific document that accomplishes an estate planning purpose and maps out some specific things of how that gets done. This is zooming out a little bit, but it's in addition to a will or a revocable living trust.
Yeah, I would say that the will is the how, but it's not the why, and it deals with like formal estate planning deals with the mechanics, but not the mission. You're gonna fall flat on your face if you go to an estate planning attorney, but and like don't have and they'll help you say, hey, how do you distribute these things, but not the why, right? And like, does this make sense? And how long do we want this trust to exist? And okay, how is charity or philanthropy incorporated into this? And how do we give kids the money now? These are questions that you have to take a step back to answer. So this is done in concert with an estate plan. But I appreciate you calling that out. That matters.
And some of maybe the most important question. So a trust will dictate that person A, B, and C get this amount of money. Well, let's first ask the question, are person A, B, and C ready to receive that amount of money? And what do we need to do? What conversations do we need to have to help this be a blessing and not a burden?
And do beneficiaries A, B, and C know why we're giving them the money? And do beneficiaries A, B, and C know what we hope they will do with the money? And do they have a thread of, hey, how am I part of this team, this family, this entity? Yeah, so I think those are all really good things, and it kind of bodes nicely into the next point, which is role assignment, right? And that's really the next big point. Is like, I would say it takes a village to like do this thoughtfully, right? Nobody who's done good legacy family generational planning has done it alone. It takes a village. And so a great analogy Justin and I were talking about before this is like, this is a team sport. Like family generational planning is a team sport, right? Like generation one is all bought in, but generation two is not. You're going to have problems there. Or if you hire the wrong professionals, or if there's tension between the beneficiaries and the trustee, there's a lot of potential points of breakdown because this is a team sport. So having the right people on your team and the right mission is crucial, crucial, crucial to long-term success of a family's generational plan.
Absolutely. And what would we say if we kind of quickly go through what are all of the different roles that someone would need to think through?
Yeah, he outlines this and goes into greater detail in the book. But like, so there's role assignment, there's roles, and then the kind of responsibilities within those roles, right? He talks about the beneficiary and how he talks about this idea of having control of the assets without ownership, right? It gets back to Justin's point of like, hey, this exists for your benefit, but it's also not about you. And so kind of balancing those two pieces of tension of like preparing somebody to be a beneficiary and thinking about being a team player and how do I deploy my capital in line with the family's purpose of, how do I coordinate those things, and being a good beneficiary is a taught skill. And how do I relay trust to the trustee, especially when we may disagree on stuff, right? Like being a beneficiary and being a good beneficiary is a skill.
Can I ask a dumb question?
Yeah.
Okay, so he talks about beneficiaries, and those are a lot of really good ideas. What if we hear beneficiary and you're thinking, okay, that is someone who's listed on my 401k. When I pass away, they are going to get $2 million. What's the difference between that beneficiary and the beneficiary James Hughes is talking about in the book?
That's a good question. I would say those are similar, right? Like, I would say beneficiaries are anyone in the second generation who can execute on the family's mission, right? So like it could, in most of the time it is, and most of the time it is your retirement beneficiaries because it's just next of kin and it naturally happens. But maybe that's not always the case, right? Maybe you you don't execute, maybe you don't, right? A great example of this is if you have a special needs child and giving them a retirement benefit would disqualify them from Social Security, right? Your IRA beneficiaries might look one way, but that special needs child, they're inheriting a different type of asset in a special needs trust, but they're equal participants in the family and the mission statement. So I would say most of the time those are the same, but not exclusively. And so that's kind of where I would delineate the vernacular. But that's a great question.
And he mentioned beneficiary is control. You have some involvement, but you don't have ownership. So to kind of tie the two worlds together, would we say that that's essentially kind of a similar idea? Like if you have $7 million in IRAs, brokerage accounts spread out everywhere, and you've got 2 or 3 kids, well, right now your kids are beneficiaries, and he would maybe say have them involved in some of these conversations, but they don't yet have ownership. But one day they will.
That's right. And then two, if you had a trust that became revocable and then there was a formal trustee, that would be like another delineation, right? Because they would have like a trust that kind of exists to which they are a beneficiary of but have less control of. For like an IRA beneficiary, you could technically do what you want, the moment you inherit those assets. With a trust, if it's held in trust, there's, you know, the trust governs distributions from that account.
You don't necessarily have ownership. Yeah.
But I think the parallels exist, right? Because even if a child inherits an IRA and technically has control, if they have this framework of, hey, this exists to further my family's mission and to apply my creative capital, my unique capital to that mission, like even that framing, if it's not in the trust wrapper, drastically changes how that capital is allocated. So like even if you don't set up a trust and have a more formal arrangement, like being a good beneficiary is a skill that's learned, and you can write stuff into the trust to kind of prevent them from doing stuff. But regardless of how you inherit the assets, there's an art to being a good beneficiary, I think is what I would say.
That's a great thought. How about trustee, protectors, advisors?
Yeah. So with trustees, they have a dual mandate of being a fiduciary to the beneficiary, so operating in their best interest, but also operating in the kind of confines of what the trust is spelled out. Right. So a good trustee will balance those well. Right. And being a good beneficiary matters here because if you're a beneficiary and you think you're entitled to the whole, all the assets, you may drain those at the expense of pursuing the family's mission. Right. And so it's the trustee's obligation to really advocate for you and do what's in the best interest of you as a beneficiary, but also taking care of the trust and honoring the spirit of what was intended. So a lot of times you can see in estate planning breakdowns, the trustee and the beneficiary being at odds. And James Hughes talks about this. A lot of times it's a lack of understanding of, hey, what are my expectations or what are my obligations? So there's beneficiaries and being a good beneficiary and being coached on a beneficiary. And then trustee, having somebody who's trustworthy, who you believe can execute on these things. And they're prepared to execute on these things. And they've built up the relational equity with your beneficiaries so that the beneficiaries trust the trustee and what they're doing. And if it goes south, is there a mechanism for the trustee to be updated? There's so many considerations here, but that's really just beneficiaries and trustees.
And is it okay if I real quick just give kind of a quick example of how this could be applicable?
Do it.
So, again, let's go back. Let's say that you and maybe your spouse have accumulated $7 million. You have a couple kids, and then eventually you may have some grandkids. Well, that money is also one, it's going to likely keep growing if you continue to stay invested, even if you're taking income from it. Very possible and likely that your money continues to compound above and beyond that number. So there needs to be someone in your family who is ready to take on the role of trustee of your estate. And maybe that's one of your children, but there needs to be communication to that person. They need to understand, here's the assets, here's the form they're in. You're going to be in charge. You're going to essentially be the director of this as time goes on. And you have to make fiduciary decisions in the best interest of the members of the trust.
Yeah, and I would encourage people to consider having a trustee that's not also a beneficiary, because that's kind of a divided mandate, right? The trustee, like, you have a fiduciary duty for both, but it's hard to be objective, right? Because the trust has goals that have been embodied and encapsulated, but the beneficiary also has goals. And there, hopefully, translation of values, there's little divergence there, but there is some divergence. So it makes sense to have a trustee that's kind of a third party, but also somebody close and that has a lot of goodwill and is going to be respected and also knows the spirit of what you're trying to accomplish.
That makes sense. A third party who is not a beneficiary can really just look at that and say, let's continue to, what did we say at the beginning? Let's continue to grow this and be a good steward of this and let it grow for the next generation. If the trustee is also a beneficiary, they could be an incredible, family member, maybe a child, an adult child, but maybe they also want a beach house. And so, yeah, there can be some conflicting goals there.
Yeah. So the next thing he talks about is protectors, basically someone with no interest in the trust or assets who can just advocate for the family and for the parties, right? This is like an aunt, an uncle, family members who just have different, they don't have any economic incentive. They don't have any dog in the fight, but they understand the spirit of what's trying to be accomplished, and they could be a sounding board and a person of reason, right? And these people are valuable, right? And a potential resource to the beneficiaries and the trustees, right? And they may not ever be mentioned in the estate plan, but they're an asset to you in executing on your family's plan. So somebody that you should think about. Advisors is, we're biased as we run a financial planning firm, but having professionals in your quarter who can coordinate, and this is probably a team of professionals, not just one. You probably have an estate planning attorney in here, a financial planner, an investment advisor, and a tax professional, all working together to execute, more on the executional side of, hey, how do we translate this in a way that optimizes for tax and considers the generational planning implications and the estate tax implications. But those, having those people to execute on it in a coordinated way and help you translate, your family's mission in the most tax efficient ways is a huge, huge value add, an important part of, the village that it takes to build a valuable family generational plan.
I'm going to just add one really quick point here. When you think about a trustee, beneficiaries having advisors in there too, I do think one of the reasons why people end up hiring us is to have an objective voice into your financial situation. Right now, we're in the middle of a market correction, and every talking head, every news outlet you look at really thinks that this is just going to keep getting worse and this is going to be a market crash. Maybe it does turn into a market crash, maybe it doesn't, but it's really helpful to have someone who's not necessarily in the thick of it, who's able to step back and say, we again are going to have a long-term mindset. And let's go back to the first episode we did on this book. That was podcast number 23. Long term, according to James Hughes, is 100 years. Intermediate term is 20 to 50 years. And so again, having someone who's not necessarily in the day-to-day, who can step back and have a really long-term generational mindset is really important.
Yeah. And the last one I want to touch on is mentors, right? And these are people, and I love James' framing of this. It's people who don't provide answers, but they help the beneficiaries ask the right questions, right? That leads them to further self-discovery and self-actualization, right? So these are people like family, friends, a network of people that are close to you, close to the beneficiaries, that can really just kind of serve as a sounding board and help unearth the tough question of, okay, here's my family's mission and here's my skill set. How do we connect these two things? Which is a huge thing. And that one is more nebulous, but really, what you should take away, I think, it's kind of a combination of points 1 and 2. Take inventory of who are these people in your life and how might they work together in accomplishing these said goals. Because really, if you're going to be thoughtful about this, there's so many different bases to cover and so many different people to prepare. So that needs to start now, and it's it's not impossible work, but it's hard work. But we're confident that just by being empowered and really understanding all the dynamics and getting ahead of it, you can well position yourself.
Absolutely. Let's finish with practice makes perfect. What do you want to call out there?
Yeah. So this is really the biggest application piece. The biggest way I think, and this is a good takeaway from the book, is to give people exposure and mechanisms to act. Right. So like the problem with most legacy plans is the beneficiaries inherit money without clarity, without purpose, without vision, or any practice implementing on these things. So there's a couple of key ideas that we want to talk about that really are kind of practical ways. And Justin, we can maybe get even more practical. But the first one is coordinated family philanthropy. Like Justin said, the family mission statement should incorporate, hey, here's the things we're passionate about, but also how do the things we're passionate about impact the world around us, right? It should have those two ideas connected in it. But coordinated family philanthropy is a great way to get generations involved today. So a mechanism we recommend a lot for clients, a donor advised fund. You can add people to make grants, or you can have grant holders, and people can make grants on the beneficiary. So if you have young kids, having them find a cause they are passionate about that aligns with the family mission, and making an annual gift, whether it's through the donor advised fund or just through allowance, or set aside funds from their budget. That's a great way, is giving together as a family, both of financial capital, but of your time and volunteering, and finding ways to incorporate that is a great way to reflect values and just begin to give them experience to what matters, why you're doing what you're doing, and the good you hope to accomplish in the world.
And I want to go back real quick. The first episode we did on this, he pointed out that there's two typical failures that you see when the second generation or third generation inherits money. One of them is they just spend everything. They go wild, they spend everything, and it's all squandered. That's kind of the popular, you hear a lot about that. The second one is someone who is responsible and they inherit this money. Maybe they get, $5-10 million and they didn't know they were getting that much money. And they are almost crippled because they have no idea. They didn't know they were getting it. They don't know, well, what did mom or dad want me to do with this? And it just cripples them. And so having some coordinated family philanthropy, and I know you were going to mention a family bank, having some of these conversations helps remove, if there's purpose behind it, it removes the odds of the next generation squandering it or being crippled by it.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, a family bank is essentially it's a mechanism, right, to where any member of the family can go to it and petition, right, in a very formal and organized, memorialized way, right, like with a business plan or an application or what. And you could purpose that however you want, but basically petitioning the family to make an investment in them. In the book, James is really formal with how that is structured, but I love the spirit of that idea. And you can, Justin, you and I were talking about this before. This can serve really well across all stages. You can, a 10-year-old with a lemonade stand could use, the family bank to fund that. A 20-year-old seeking to go to medical school could, use the family bank application to do that. A 30-year-old who wants to quit their job and start a business could use the family bank to do that, right? But helping the kids understand that the beneficiaries, that they have a mechanism to make bets and deploy capital and take risk, right? Because risk and return are correlated, but you want to have positive long-term returns. So making the bets that hopefully make life worthwhile and that can really have compound and outsized returns in your human capital, right? There needs to be a mechanism and a structure to do that, right? Like living a legacy is better than leaving one, right? There's also marginal utility from the people making the grants to get to see the kids get practice and get to see the benefit of them allocating that capital in those meaningful ways. But the family bank is just a great framework for having the kids have opportunities to deploy capital and to ask for money, and not a handout. There needs to be a business plan. There needs to be an intention, and it needs to be connected to the family's values, but having a mechanism to thoughtfully deploy capital in meaningful ways.
Man, I am just loving that example of medical school. So I want to play this out just real briefly, but what an incredible idea. I mean, I think back to my time in college and thinking through my fraternity, but also just shoot, think about your own kids. If your kids grow up even with this mindset that, hey, we want to be great stewards of every resource we have, and we want to grow every resource we have for the next generation, and maybe you are absolutely paying for your kids' college. That's great. I love that. But what if instead of simply paying for it, your kids grow up with this mindset that, hey, we want to be stewards and pass down more to the next generation, and they've got to submit an application to the family in order to get college paid for? There would be so much more intention and just so much more purpose behind. And I think the 18-year-old or the 22-year-old going to law school would have so much more purpose behind their next educational endeavor.
You answer the question why, right? You forced your child to answer the question, why is it worth it being paid for by potential family assets, right? And like a lot of people don't even ask that question. Okay, because I'll make more money. Well, how much more money? What are you going to do with said money, right? Like really helping people flesh out the economic and personal implications of that. I think it's a really helpful exercise, because I was, personally, I was on the other end of the spectrum where, my parents were going to pay a certain amount, but they wanted me to have skin in the game. But there wasn't a conversation as to, as to why, or, it was kind of nebulous, right? But they knew they wanted me to have skin in the game, but it wasn't really connected to a family mission. And I'm grateful for it. It was a different way, but, in hindsight, there's different risk and returns. So, had I done a little more due diligence, I may have arrived at a different decision. And I'm really glad I did what I did. But it's an interesting thought exercise, and I just love the idea of a family bank. And it ages well, kind of like what I said earlier. If you can implement that really early on, it's not a handout, but it's a thoughtful investment in ways that meaningfully move the needle in terms of your family's capital.
Yeah, that's a great thought. And it connects people. Like it's fun to think, gosh, I should have done this with kids going to summer camp. But yeah, it's applicable at all ages. And I think, big idea to wrap up. We talk a lot about all different areas of financial planning. Estate planning is one of the 5 principles that the CFP board, emphasizes. Now, estate planning is typically, how do you pass down assets? What are the tax, investment, and legal implications of passing down assets? This book is an awesome thought exercise in something that is just as or more important. Estate planning gets the assets to the next generation. But don't forget to ask the question, is the next generation ready to receive the assets? And are they going to then be able to pass it down to their next generation? So I love this topic.
Yeah, we'll wrap up there. We've gotten some good feedback in the past few weeks from listeners, so we appreciate it. Keep it coming. Ideas for future episodes, feedback on the format, podcast at Browning Wealth Management. Thanks. We'll see you next time.